I think food banks do a fantastic job, but I think we shouldn't. So, food banks get all kinds of emergency food aid has now become a routine part of food provisioning for lots of people, literally millions of people each day. I think they do a great job. They partly help reduce food waste as well, food redistribution of surplus. But in a country like ours, we shouldn't be relying on emergency food aid to feed the population. So there is a sign of the failure, I think, of the official food system, but that's not at all at any rate the work that's involved in providing food for those who need it. There are all sorts of other questions about food banks as well, about connections to religious organisations, about culture of food. You could go on, but my basic position is they do a great job, but they shouldn't have to.
Do you have any comments about the biotech stroke A1 fixes? How useful they might be or not?
Yep, okay. I do, yes. So there's a lot of emphasis now on can we use modern biotechnology methods, genetic engineering, for example, to increase agricultural productivity. And the answer is yes, it can. But a key question to me is the public acceptability of those methods. So one of our work packages is about biofortification. Some aspects of biofortification need you to fortify food before harvest. So you could do that through fertilizers, you could do it through conventional breeding, or you could do it through GM. All the evidence from our surveys with the public say the ones that the public are least accepted to the public are those that involve animals and those that involve political application. Those that involve plants are much less. So lots of debates about public understanding of those things. So even biofortification is a term. People don't like it. Sounds far too scientific and sort of Frankenstein theory stuff. So yeah, my view probably isn't that much. It's more what the consensus is. But I think biotechnology has a role to play. Some of the work we've done is quite low tech, but involves biotechnology. So things like growing food in climate controlled in polytunnels. Our model for the farm, most of many of you, I think in Sheffield, up the edges of Sheffield, has polytunnels which we help them build, and we're trying to do controlled environment agriculture, not with lots of heavy inputs, not lots of heating and lighting and so on, doing it in natural conditions with little water time. Those kinds of things I think are ways in which we've met not to take advantage of recent advances in biotech. But it comes along with all of the public concerns there are about GM food in general. Is that the goal? So yeah, for the biotech, it's interesting, a lot of it's labeling as well. If you say biofortified, people are much less likely to be interested in buying it. If you say naturally enriched, or some other phrase like that. So there's loads of scope for greenwash, for better public communication. But that's exactly the area where there's a very high debate going on.
Yeah, I think it's unforeseen consequences.
Yeah, So this gets us into quite complicated areas of food regulation. So if we produce food like 80,000 calorie, if we produce food as a university research organisation, to sell it to the public or even give it away to food have to be a registered food business and have to be a food business organisation. And that's quite expensive to register. That's part of the reason why some of those experiments end up with food that we either have to give away ourselves or can't become commercial or even charity. So I think that that's not how the food is produced or the quality of the food or anything like that. It's more to do with regulation. And the head of the food standard settings was at meeting earlier this week, Tuesday this week. And you know, we're going to get phytosanitary stuff harmonised with the EU, those problems will go away. I don't think they will. So I think you're right, you can produce high quality food, nutritious food, but if you can't get it to market, there's something wrong with the political regulation system that needs to change. Yeah. I have to say, I think the work that Emily is doing is fantastic. Any of the farmers participating in every university project we've had, really keen to benefit from participating in that kind of research. It's probably unusual for what's it called?
I think I've got a loud enough voice. You mentioned Eddie Andrews from Our Molly, and I had a long chat with him prior to this event. One of the things he's very interested in is the amount of green fields that are being given up for building, and he looks at how many people could have been fed from the green field that has been given away. And I wondered if that was included in your project at all, whether you looked at all the farmland that's been sold for building.
Yeah, it's not directly part of what we do. There's a thing called the land use framework, which has just come out from DEFRA, and the land use framework is trying to balance the demand for land for different uses. So that would include the need for low-cost housing, it would include leisure and recreational use in the countryside, but also crucially include farmland. I think what Eddie Andrews is up against, though, is that we need less farmland to produce more food in the industrialised intensive system. So it's an uphill battle for him to say that farmland should stay as farmland rather than be used for these other purposes. But yeah, the sort of official response is the land use framework, because it's not a sort of around. It is a framework. It tries to get those different competing interests on the same page.
It is on, right, fantastic. Thanks for a really interesting talk, and it's a fantastic subject. I wanted to really ask about food security, particularly with the situation in the Middle East. And I think the statistics say that 70% of land in the UK is designated as farmland. One thing that I realised this week, I was told this week, that 85% of that 75% of land is either animals grazing or you're growing food to feed the animals. So it's about the diet shift. So if we make that shift, presumably we could be much more secure in food, and that would be an important thing in view of the global situation. But also there's another factor here, and it's climate change, which is making growing food in this country more difficult. So I wondered if you could give a response to that. Thank you.
So the first point you made is absolutely right. I should have said more about that in the food security. The kind of geopolitical circumstances, war in Ukraine, what's going on in the Straits of Hormuz and so on, you can see immediate impacts of those geopolitical circumstances on food prices. I think that's not going to go away. So we definitely need to take that into consideration. I think one of the things that happens that when you start to think in those geopolitical terms, you start to equate food security with national self-sufficiency. And I don't think they are the same thing. So you could have a secure food supply as long as the sources of trade are properly regulated and not subject to those kind of geopolitical circumstances. So I think there's a sort of, certainly with the DEFRA, the argument goes, whatever it is, 60% self-sufficient in veg, and could increase that a lot. there's a tendency to equate food security in a country like the UK with national self-sufficiency. And I don't think those two things are the same thing. It's a political debate about how much you want to support British farmers, for example. We've done some cost recently in terms of inheritance tax and other changes, sustainable food, sustainable farming incentive programs being suddenly dropped. So there's lots of pressure on British farming, and I'm very supportive of British farming. And I don't think that's the same. Certainly, if you take a global perspective, you don't want each country trying to produce food for itself without any view of what's happening elsewhere. So for me, we still need trade, but we need trade on more equal and socially just terms that we can.
My question builds on that a bit, which is that years ago the idea of food miles was in the news a lot. It's not in the news much now. It used to be argued that reducing food miles was an essential part of sustainability. But as I popped into my local Waitrose and saw some produce strawberries for sale, I wondered whether they'd been grown in a greenhouse. I just wonder whether there's been a growing cynicism towards food miles, which has led to its demise in popular discourse. Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing?
So food miles, I think it was introduced by Tim Lang, who was the food policy guy who was on the radio at the time, and I think it was useful as a shorthand term, a bit like air miles, think of all the miles that have come to get food from where it's grown to your table. Why it fell out of this, I think, was because it was oversimplifying the sustainability question. So a good example, the example that's usually used is, are we better off having tomatoes grown in greenhouse with lots of inputs in terms of feed, or it seems paradoxical, it actually might be more sustainable to import those tomatoes from Almeria in Spain when they grow under sunshine. So definitely the thing that basically tried to criticise food miles as an oversimplified metric of sustainability. So we're saying you can't just measure the miles and say shorter miles is better environmentally if those sorts of conditions apply. So something grown inside life and then transported might be more sustainable. The actual transport costs are much less than the costs in terms of heating or fertiliser or other inputs earlier on in the supply chain. That doesn't mean though that we shouldn't also be emphasising seasonality, which you just mentioned, or locality as well. Eating strawberries in December is probably not a sustainable strategy either, virtually any circumstances. So yeah, places like Waitrose will emphasise locality and seasonality, but they'll also want to have blueberries and strawberries available year round. And again, that's a consumer pressure, where we've got used to having that, and all those demand retailers will be busy supplying. But that's the reason why food miles was a popular way of conveying issues of sustainability for people like Tim Lang. It's also why sort of got queried as an oversimplification. So I've got the final
It's roughly the same question. It was also about distribution systems. The idea that shipping apples or wine halfway around the world makes sense seems to me to be absurd. We make lots of wine in Europe, so why are we shipping it from Australia? Raising avocados at enormous cost in water and inputs, and then shipping them halfway around the world. I mean, they don't grow in Britain, of course, but there are absurdities in the system as far as I can see. And then you get things like Tesco, and they have a big sign saying seasonal fruit, and it's apples from New Zealand. So how can we unpick the system in some ways so that we do the sensible things, but recognise the absurdity of the things that aren't sensible.
Okay, that's a very good point. So apples is a really good example, because in the UK we used to have literally dozens of different varieties of apples grown in Kent and elsewhere in the UK, and suddenly if you go to the supermarket now there will be apples imported from France or Canada or New Zealand or all over the world. It is absurd. I sort of hate to think of it. But there's a kind of political economy that explains how we got to that situation. So for the smaller varieties, it wasn't as easy for a supermarket to ship them across the UK or wider. They wanted consistency, uniformity, all of which worked against the...
How much does the supermarkets want to do for consumers like us?
Well, okay. The supermarkets will say, I'm looking at Tesco now, the supermarkets will say they're just responding to consumer demand. Consumers want a regular supply of cheap food, and it's our job to provide it. I think that's slightly audacious often. So I think we get used to certain things in the shops, and that's what we've got to expect. That's the kind of cultural expectation. But there's plenty of us now who want to have a wider variety of apples in particular that can be grown, and just more of a headache for supermarkets to provide that and to provide it at a competitive price. So I think it's easy to kind of blame consumers, but right, for example, why is all that food waste going on if consumers don't? I don't think that's the case at all. So it's partly consumer education and awareness kind of thing, but I think more of the power lies in the supermarkets, especially in the UK. 70% of groceries in the UK come from 4 big supermarkets. So clearly lots of growers over here, lots of consumers over here, and the kind of pinch point is retail. So I think retail is a highly significant player. Which is why projects like Transforming UK Food Systems, we haven't said we're not going to touch them, we're not going in and there, we've tried to engage with them through people like Food and Drink Federation and the grocery distribution. But there's so much vested interest in the system that currently stands, it's really hard to change.
We've got time for one more, I'll give it to
Right, you were just talking about supermarkets and how they accounted for 70% of retail food. Now, the alternatives are things like box skins, but many neighbourhoods don't have access to supermarkets or are dependent on convenience stores where healthy food is sadly lacking. Would you like to expand on that?
I'll try, yeah. So there's been a lot of research done on topic of food deserts, and in poorer parts of the country which don't have access to fruit vegetables at a competitive price. And where you tend to get lots of fried chicken shops. So there's been some regulation, hasn't there? There's been planning regulations used to stop them being near schools, for example. But it's, again, it's an economy question. How have we got to the situation where supermarkets won't invest in poorer neighbourhoods as a kind of problem? So smaller shops, convenience shops and so on, crowd their pockets. So my view, which is not very popular in the government, is you need to subsidise food and vegetables rather than subsidising the produce a bit more level playing field. So governments, either any persuasion of will not make that argument. But I think that's the argument. There are food deserts, and some people talk about food spots as well, which is spots by the long time. And there's a geography to that. It's very uneven, especially. And it's also got a really strong economy about why it is investment from big retailers in those areas is considered to be not something they're looking at.
There's the last word, then.
If I have a problem and I've got too much something, then I
I think the answer is no, technically, because you're not a food business operator. But my understanding of documents is there's an awful lot of exchange and trading and reciprocity going on.
Yeah, but that means that I'm exchanging with other people who've got stuff.
Who might not have the same lot that you have at the same time.
Thank you. Well, we could go on for a long time.